When talking about security and history in the north, there was a time in history when the issue was not security for the Nordics, but security from the Nordics. And I am, of course, referring to the Viking period. But as we Finns can portray us, depending on the circumstances, as either Vikings or their victims, I will say no more on this. But then there was a period when the most pressing security issue in the north was security from other Nordic countries. And the war in the north was mostly war between Sweden and Denmark. And this period lasted from the 13th century right up to the first years of the 19th century. Since then, the Nordics have been at peace with each other and have wanted to remain so with the rest of the world as well. And this was possible during the First World War, except for Finland, which was until 1917 a part of the Russian Empire and had to undergo a bloody civil war in 1918. During the interwar period, the Nordic countries tried to adhere to neutrality, with Finland joining the other Nordics in 1935. But this did not save us from attack. Finland from the Soviet Union in the Winter War, and Denmark and Norway from Germany next year. After the war, Denmark, Norway and Iceland opted for NATO membership, while Sweden remained neutral, and Finland accommodated herself to Russian security interests as embodied in the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance. After the end of the Cold War, Finland dissolved the treaty with Russia, but Finland remained a militarily non-aligned country, but also retained its sovereign right to reconsider this should changes in the security environment call for it. After joining the EU, Finland did not claim to be a neutral country any longer, and even our military non-alignment was not an ideological posture, but a description of our status as not being a member of any military alliance. We had been supporters of developing defense cooperation in the EU, but did not see this as compatible with NATO membership. But while the wording of the Article 42.7 in the treaty, the European Treaty, is actually more binding than NATO's Article 5, the EU is not a military alliance with the kind of joint military structures and plans for military operations that NATO has. But this is changing because Europe needs to build up so-called strategic autonomy, and that also means having structures for taking on more demanding crisis management operations if for some reason, think of Trump and Turkey, NATO resources were unavailable for the task. Opinion in Finland had been firmly against NATO membership, but it started to change in the autumn of 2021 as Finns reacted to Russia's bullying warnings to Sweden and Finland to refrain from joining NATO. The majority was still in favor of staying out until February 2022, when almost overnight opinion swung to favoring membership, support for which, according to polls, grew to between 80 and 90% in the spring. And this was reflected in our vote on our membership application, which was approved in Parliament with 187 votes for and only 7 against. And I stress that the pragmatic nature of our post-war relationship with Russia was not blue-eyed trust. Contrary to what most NATO countries did after the end of the Cold War, we did not run down our national defense or end conscription. And this means that we are unique among European countries with the ability to mobilize and equip, if needed, a trained military reserve of 280,000 soldiers out of a total trained reserve of 900,000. And within a few weeks after the attack on Ukraine, it became clear that Finland was going to send its application to NATO. And once this became clear, it also became supremely important for us to get Sweden to do the same in more or less the same timetable. A situation where only one of the two would be in NATO and the other outside would be extremely negative for both of us, irrespective of who was in and who was out. And the message sent out from Finland to our Swedish colleagues was the same between governments, parliamentarians and parties. Finland was going to send in its application to join NATO, irrespective of what Sweden was going to do, but we were also extremely anxious to see Sweden do the same. If the issue was difficult for many Finns, it was much more a profound new orientation for Sweden, which since 1814 had been following a policy of neutrality, which had kept it out of all minor and bigger wars, including the two world wars. For us, joining NATO was a defensive move, which should not be seen as a threat towards anyone, but Russia, of course, inevitably will portray it as such. And it was not a 180-degree turnaround, but rather a continuation of our policy seeking to prevent war and enhance common security for all. And we joined NATO without setting any preconditions and with the same rights and obligations as other member states. While honouring Article 5, the commitment to come to the aid of any member states coming under attack, we in peace time retain our sovereign right to determine what kind of military exercises and where we shall participate in, and when and what kind of military presence from our allies we will welcome in Finland. And while we accept the need for nuclear deterrence globally and NATO as a nuclear alliance, we retain our legislation prohibiting the import into or transfer through Finland of any kind of nuclear weapons. And in addition to adapting our legislation to membership, we have also ratified a bilateral cooperation agreement with the US, giving Americans access to 15 military bases in Finland. And this eagerness in which Finland and Sweden have shown the DC agreements reflects the fact that there are also many in our countries who have placed more trust in the US than in NATO. And this was for decades the case with Sweden, which had a long-standing special military relationship with the US while remaining outside NATO. This was, of course, a secret, but as such a relatively open one. But this was before the second Trump administration took office in Washington. And today, there are many in our countries who place less trust in the US than in our European partners in NATO and the EU. We have to live with the recognition of the fact that if Trump can throw Ukraine under the bus, it can also do the same for Finland if the occasion arose. And here a word about Finnish and Swedish relations. Of all countries in the world, it is Sweden which has the clearest and weightiest self-interest in Finland's survival, while other countries from much further away may feel strong sympathy for Finland were we to come under threat. We can recall all the strong messages of solidarity that reached us in 1939 from all over the world, the US included. None of them, with the partial exception of the other Nordic countries, have the same degree of self-interest in supporting Finland, and their interest elsewhere may easily override the call to come to Finland's aid. And this was also true during the Winter War, when Sweden did not adhere to strict neutrality, but declared herself a non-belligerent country. And this made it possible for Sweden to aid Finland with substantial financial, humanitarian, and also military aid in the form of volunteers and weapons, including a third of the Swedish Air Force fighting in northern Finland. This aid in all its forms was crucial for our survival, and it can also be said that that was also the case when Sweden refused to allow the transit of the planned Anglo-French expeditionary force to Finland. Out of this planned expeditionary force of 40,000 soldiers, only a few thousand were meant to join the Finnish forces fighting the Red Army. The bulk of the Anglo-French forces would have stayed in Sweden to occupy the iron ore minefields and prevent the exports of crucial raw materials to Germany. And thus for Finland, accepting the Anglo-French offer would not have affected the military outcome of the Winter War, but only added to our casualties and losses by prolonging the fighting. It has been my expectation that Finland and other Nordic countries in NATO, while giving our unreserved contribution to the collective security of the alliance, will also continue our long-standing endeavours to work for arms control, disarmament, and removal of the existential threat to humankind of nuclear war. Our policy as a NATO member should also in the future have two pillars. One is to be sufficiently prepared for the worst, and the other is to be active so that the worst will never happen. And these are by no means incompatible with each other, but on the contrary are both necessary and complementary. And it will be just as dangerous to neglect one as the other. And this means not falling for wishy-washy wishful thinking about appeasement, working with Russia, but also equally to espousing self-fulfilling alarmist calls for preparing for Russian attacks within the next 2 years. Thank you.